All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum, organized by the MIT Mobility Initiative. Today, we'll focus on the safety question. I'm actually really glad to have our very own Bhuvan Atluri and John Muanzadi present a piece of research, really focus on there are many aspects influence the safety, of course, right? After decades of decline, healthy decline of the accident, etc., but the trend has been rising again among many factors, the distracted driver, related to the heavier car, infrastructure, also the whole anxiety out of COVID. There are many factors, right? But today we'll focus on specific on the performance characteristic of the vehicle itself, right? So later I will invite John to actually give the introduction formally to this research. Before I start, I do want to say, do the same thing to reinforce the norm of this forum, which is everybody, the audience, everybody from the audience actually contribute one idea to the presentation. Please type into the chat, either a comment to the presentation or a question to the presentation, right? As a warm-up exercise, I invite everyone to type your organization, your local city, and time, so that we get a sense of the audience today. So I do that MIT, Cambridge, 12, no. Good. Thank you. Yeah. So, of course, Bhuvan and John, probably everybody know very well. I just say John is the executive director of a mobility initiative, and Bhuvan is associate director of research. Now, I'll give the forum to John. Yes.
Thanks so much, Jinhua. So we're going to talk a little bit about some research that Bhuvan has led with respect to the general topic being road safety. And I just want to introduce sort of the topic and why it's so important. So more than 20 years ago, the World Health Organization published its first report, basically declaring road-related fatalities as a public health crisis in the world. And it's interesting to me to think that this was a report put out by a UN agency tasked with public health, not by an organization that was tasked with looking at transportation as a system or anything like that. And it's because at the time, the findings were, it pointed the magnitude of this problem that 1.3 million people are killed each year on the world's roads globally. Now, that number, the good news is that number has come down ever so slightly. In its latest report, the number is about 1.19 million fatalities. But those are fatalities. There's an additional 20 to 50 million people that are injured on our roads each year. And you can only imagine that each of those individuals has a story, has a family that's been devastated. So this is really a very significant issue. Road fatalities are the leading cause of death for children and young adults between the ages of 5 and 29. And this is true in most countries around the world. And also, more than half of the people killed on the world's roads, of those 1.19 million people, more than half of them are killed outside of a motor vehicle, vulnerable road users, pedestrians, and cyclists. So just with that as an introduction, let's take a look at this global distribution. And maybe, Bhuvan, if you could pull up the first slide. This is a map of what this looks like on a global basis using that WHO data. So it's kind of a heat map. And we're looking at traffic deaths per 100,000 people in the population of given countries. And so what you see here is in parts of Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, it's a very relatively high proportion of individuals. But I want to specifically point to the United States and the differentiation between the United States and Europe, as well as our neighbors to the north, Canada. So if we go to the next slide, I want to refer to some analysis that Todd Littman at the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, and by the way, I heartily recommend the work of Todd. He's done some interesting analysis just looking at the latest data coming out of the European Union that looks at the 27 member countries of the European Union. Switzerland is added in here, and then Canada and the US. And looking at that same metric, this is deaths per 1 million in the population versus 100,000 in the population. But what you see here is that the United States is not in an enviable position. And of course, if we take a step back and we ask, what's driving this? Why is it more dangerous as an American than it is as a Canadian or a European? And a big part of that has to do with vehicle miles traveled, right? We spend more time moving in cars in this country than in many countries in Europe. We spend more than our neighbors to the north as well, but the difference in VMT does not account for this differential, does not fully account for this differential between fatality rates on our roads in the United States versus Canada. So you're more than almost 3 times as likely to suffer from a road fatality here in the US than in Canada to the north. So if we go to the next slide, this is something that several individuals have been talking about. David Zipper has done a lot of great work in this area, one of our senior fellows at the MIT Mobility Initiative, a term that he calls car bloat, which is basically to say, in this country, in the United States, if you look at the best-selling vehicle, what it looked like in 1975, what it looked like 24 years ago, what it looks like now, these vehicles are getting heavier and they are getting larger as well. And we can see that in the trend chart that's shown here, that is using data from the US Environmental Protection Agency. This is almost 5 decades of data. So this is looking at the average vehicle weight for these different categories of vehicles in the United States. The blue line in the middle is an average across all light vehicles, meaning cars, pickup trucks, sport utility vehicles. And then the upper line is looking just at what we call light trucks in the United States, which is sport utility vehicles, pickup trucks, minivans, and so forth. And then the lower line being passenger cars. And you can see, particularly toward the last few years, this acceleration, this trend of car bloat has actually accelerated. So then if we look at the next slide, so we ask, well, what's the impact of this sort of supersizing of US vehicles? The Economist recently ran a very interesting story that many of you may have seen, where they did some basic analysis and they said, look, if 2 cars collide with each other, if everything else is equal, you're generally better off with the heavier, being an occupant of the heavier car than the lighter vehicle. This is just basically the laws of physics. But then when they added in the fatality rate and compared your fatality rate between the 2 different vehicles, the fatality rate is, about 7 times higher when colliding with a particularly heavy vehicle than with a smaller passenger car. This, and the converse of that is also true. As you drive a heavier vehicle, you're more likely to injure or kill the person in the other vehicle. And you can see if you look to the right on this chart here, which is looking again, sort of the car that you drive versus the car that someone else is driving, at the extreme right of that, where a very, very large and heavy vehicle collides with a very small, compact vehicle, this ratio of, sort of who is killed or injured is extremely high. Okay, so that's sort of our general concept of safety. A lot of our safety culture seems to have been built around protecting the occupants of vehicles with not as much consideration to the people outside of the vehicle, the so-called vulnerable road users, the cyclists and the pedestrians. And, it is alarming in this country that pedestrian crash deaths have risen by, almost 90%, to the point where about 7,500 people are being killed in the United States in road-related, 7,500 pedestrians and cyclists are being killed in the US out of the 43,000 total. So this is deeply concerning. A number of studies released recently by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety have talked about the blind spots on these vehicles. And we just recently had Chris Carter from MassDOT present some very interesting work that he did with colleagues at Volpe about how the blind spots in operating these large vehicles are much greater, particularly for right-hand turns and things like that, and the implications that that has for pedestrians and cyclists. And just a shout out to Justin Tyndall at the University of Hawaii, who's tried to sort of quantify this impact of larger and more dangerous vehicles. Okay. And this, I think, is a very simple slide that sort of shows it. This is from an organization called Smart Growth America. This is looking in the United States, the share of fatalities for people inside the vehicle versus the vulnerable road users. And, it's an alarming trend. And as I mentioned earlier, the World Health Organization calculates that more than on a global basis, more than half of those 1.19 million fatalities are people outside of vehicles. So, we're moving in the wrong direction. And I think that sort of helps to introduce sort of our motivation for looking at this and the work that Bhuvan has done. So I think with that, I hand it over to my colleague, Bhuvan.
All right. Thank you, John, for very wonderfully setting the context of why we did this work. Like Jinhua mentioned in the introduction, there are many factors: distracted driving, larger cars, heavier cars, bigger cars, more modes mixing in the same streetscape, and obviously our infrastructure having been built around the car doesn't really help matters. So we figured let's at least start with one aspect of this and see if we can get to some insights here, which may lead to better informed decision making or policy making. So we started off with creating this task of creating the US. So apologies for the folks joining from other parts of the world. I know we have a lot of participants from other parts of the world as well. This is slightly US specific. I mean, a lot of these models are sold globally, so hopefully there'll be some relevance to your markets as well. But to start off with, we created this US light duty vehicle database. We used multiple sources. We used carsheet.io, web scraping, to get model year, trim, price, body, very, basic data of the car. We used two sources such as Car and Driver and Motor Trend to get the performance data of these cars. And performance is not just acceleration, your 0 to 60 miles per hour in seconds, 0 to 96 kilometers per hour for, folks outside the US, but also braking, because braking is equally, if not more important than your acceleration. So for braking, we looked at 70 miles per hour to 0 in feet. So we used Car and Driver as our standard source, and Motor Trend when Car and Driver didn't have enough data for a particular variant or a model. And in some cases, we use another source called 0 to 60 spec, but like 98% of our data, performance data, is from Car and Driver and Motor Trend, two very, very reputable magazines in the US. To give some picture to this data, we used the 1 foot rollout in the acceleration time to give a true realistic picture. And we are using the 70 miles per hour to 0 metric because highway speeds in the US are often 70 miles per hour or more. So we felt that's a good metric to have, even though Motor Trend does a 60 to 0 in braking as well. The braking data is only for dry braking. These are used, this is all tested using the tires and brakes that are provided with the car from factory by the manufacturer. There'll be, a lot of people can ask, replacement is a huge question mark. People may go for, lower spec tires or lower spec brake pads and discs when they replace their, the parts are due for replacement. But we are not looking at that right now. What the manufacturer provided with the car from factory is what was tested and what is in this database. And I mean, just as an example, the vehicle miles traveled of new cars is more for the first 5 years. So I think that's a good, place to start with. So with all this, we ended up with, a database of over 300 US light duty vehicle models, 600 plus, trim levels from model year 2020 onwards. We didn't want to go too far back. So we stuck for 2028 for now, but as the research progresses, we can increase the model year specs. John mentioned on this, but again, it's quite confusing. I just want to mention that this is a light duty vehicle. In the US, it's defined as less than 8,500 pounds. Passenger cars typically consist of your 4-door sedans, station wagons, coupes, hatchbacks, and convertibles. Light trucks consist of pickup trucks, SUVs, minivans, and vans. Some analysis does include like heavy light duty trucks like the F450 and medium duty passenger vehicles such as your full size SUVs like your Chevy Suburbans. So those come in because some of those are actually more than 8,500 pounds, which is actually quite shocking, but that's the world we live in today. So, and yeah, so no surprise to anyone, since the 1980s, due to a variety of technological innovations, turbocharging, direct injection, electronic fuel injection, quick shifting automatic gearboxes, your 0 to 60 acceleration times have halved, like from 12 to 6 seconds. And anybody our high school physics, we all learned V is equal to U plus 80. So faster your acceleration, more terminal speed, more speed you end up carrying. So, this is important because I want to stress on this slide before we get into the, the whole dashboards and the analysis. Modern cars really make accessing this quick, seamless, and strong acceleration much easier and much quieter. So the hypothesis here is, the noise vibration harshness is, masked so well, and these vehicles are capable of accelerating really, really faster. So just a few seconds of, additional throttle pressure can have, your car doing unsafe speeds, 20 to 30 miles per hour over the speed limit without even you noticing. It might not be your intention, but you just had, your foot on the throttle with a little more pressure, and, it could be a electric vehicle which has, instant torque from the get-go. It could be a dual clutch automatic car, with direct injection and turbochargers that just goes from 0 miles an hour very quickly. So the hypothesis here, there's increased probability of one encountering scenarios where the vehicle needs to shed speed quickly. If vehicles are capable of accelerating faster, people will tend to drive faster. Yes, I mean, you can make the case, hey, I own a Ferrari SF90 Stradale, but I drive like a saint and I do 0 to 60 in a minute. There will be people who may do that, but you're going to work, you're catching all the red lights on your way to work. At the third signal, you floor the pedal, and in 40 feet, you see somebody crossing the road, and now you need to shed speed. So that's the hypothesis we started off with, that faster accelerating cars, irrespective of the shape, size, drivetrain type, should have better braking performance. And usually this has been true. If you look, at manufacturers with their, performance models versus the more mainstream models, BMW M, Audi RS, Mercedes AMG, and so on and so forth, they give the cars much better braking hardware. And it's not just, these performance cars which tend to do more track days. You buy a 3-liter engine car versus a 2-liter engine car, you get better braking usually as well. But what's been happening now, especially the past couple of years, is the fast accelerating models are now available across many different model types. So it's not just, your 4-door sedans and convertibles and coupes. They're available across minivans, SUVs, pickup trucks, battery electric vehicles. So these are vehicle classes that do much more VMT. They do the school run, they do the shopping run. It's not just, weekend fun car which you take out. So one goal of this was, does this hypothesis really hold? So do faster accelerating vehicles actually have better, braking performance, because like I'm saying, this is important and you should probably account for this as manufacturers have done. So we looked at this, and before I jump into the dashboard, this is not anti-car and this is not anti-technology. I think this was the whole report was designed to provide a data-driven analysis of various performance metrics and vehicle design factors for the car fleet in the US. Pickup trucks are immensely useful and effective in carrying and towing heavy loads, but we are increasingly seeing them replacing sedans and hatchbacks and being used exclusively for shopping errands, commuting, not hauling and towing. The effect of having the dominant vehicle on the road, 80% of new car sales are SUVs and pickup trucks. So that needs to be studied here. So what we wanted to provide with this and the data and the analysis is a clear picture on the inadequacies of the braking performance of some of these heavier cars when compared to what one pays or how fast it accelerates. So that's what hopefully it serves as a potential guide for consumers, regulators, and policymakers. So as I mentioned, 80% of new light duty vehicle sales are SUVs and pickup trucks. It's quite staggering if you look at this. And even more staggering is that the share of full-size SUVs and pickup trucks are gaining share. It's from 2013 to less than 2%. It's now 3.5%. And it's everybody assumes that a heavier car is safer. In some cases, yes, as John pointed out in the Economist article. But I mean, one could also argue that an SUV or a pickup has lesser capacity to avoid a collision and a higher tendency to roll over than a regular car. High wheel articulation and extra ground clearance. It's great for off-roading, but everybody is just commuting on regular paved roads. So excess metal, high center of gravity, it leads to less efficient, slower, and arguably more unsafe vehicles when trying to avoid a crash. Especially when you're looking at large body on frame SUVs and pickup trucks. So with that being said, I'm just going to move into the first dashboard that I have here. So just let me know if you can see the screen share change. Okay, yeah. Let me just spend a few seconds explaining the X and Y axis. So if you can see my cursor, I just highlighted the X axis. That is your 0 to 60 miles per hour acceleration in seconds. So it's 2 seconds at the left and it's around 8.8 seconds at the right. The Y-axis is braking in feet, 70 miles per hour to 0. So obviously 140 is good, and 190 is at the far end of this. So now not so great braking performance. So what do we have on the graph here is these are passenger cars. These are passenger cars that have been if you look at the faster accelerating cars, they are all in this quadrant. So they seem to have, pretty good braking performance. And, the slower accelerating cars, that the trend is a good slope, as one would expect. As the faster you accelerate, the better the braking performance gets. And this is for cars. Now I'm just going to add SUVs into the mix here. So just bear with me, and there we go. So if you look at SUVs, once we add SUVs are in yellow, the cars are in blue. Once we add SUVs into the mix, you can see the line for the SUVs is much flatter. And I just forgot to mention that for all this analysis, we've set an upper cap of $150,000 for the price of the car. So we've removed a lot of those, supercars, hypercars out of the equation here. The line remains flat here. We have these cars such as, the F-250, Hummer EV, Mercedes EQE, SUV, Cybertruck, Rivian R1S that do 0 to 60 in like 3.2 seconds, but have nowhere near the braking capabilities of actual cars that do this, like a Porsche 718 Boxster, BMW M8 Grand Coupe, or the Corvette. So the distance is it's quite large. It's 200 versus 150, so it's like a 50-foot distance. So if you're on the road and there's a car coming towards you, you would wish that it's not one of these large SUVs that's capable of accelerating so fast. So you and I mean you can argue at p-value and all that. For most of these cases, the p-values are quite strong, 0.0001. Obviously, if you change the levers, in some cases the p-values might be larger, but in most cases they were less than the 0.5 metric that one usually considers. So And the size of the bubble, the shape, like, square is a large car, triangle is a small, and circle is a mid-size. The size is the weight. So as you can see, all these SUVs are much heavier as well, and that leads to this braking performance being not so great. So yeah, so again, it's a clear difference. You can see the gap between the two lines here, and this gets worse as the acceleration gets faster. So let me move on to the next one, and yeah, we'll come to the questions later. So let me just go back to the PowerPoint slide. All right, battery electric vehicles. I think a well-known fact, a lot of folks, in our audience is a very, very well-aware audience. They know that battery electric vehicles are typically 40% heavier than their ICE equivalent counterparts. But we know, all of us admit that BEVs are excellent from an efficiency standpoint, more than 3 times more efficient than ICE engines. But also that electric motors develop maximum torque from standstill. So, they deliver fast, seamless acceleration that you don't even realize, got your foot pinned to the throttle and you hit 60 in no time. That shows in the BEV median 0 to 60 time is 4.3, and non-BEV is, it's 6+ seconds. So we're seeing a huge difference here. And, folks in the chat might be talking about regen braking. That's good. It helps in less brake use for everyday driving. But, you need physical brakes for, hard emergency braking, because regen braking is proportional to the speed of the car. So you're never going to come to a full stop with regen braking. You always need physical brakes. So, I mean, there is some case to be made that our manufacturers putting brakes that are not as resilient in BEVs because it's not needed. But is that having an impact on hard emergency braking performance? So let's have a look into that, and also the added impact of the extra weight that these BEVs carry, given the spectacular acceleration that they have. So if I just move to the BEV dashboard, so this is all the circles in red are non-BEVs of all types, cars and SUVs, and you can see it's a good it's sort of a nice slope that you'd expect. Slow acceleration cars, not so great braking. As you go faster, the braking gets much better. The Porsche GT3 being the gold standard here with doing a 133-foot stop from 70 to 0. So let me just add back BEVs to the graph. Just bear with me while it refreshes. And here we go. Okay. So it's not as bad as the chart I showed you previously with SUVs. The gap, especially in this quadrant, is not as bad. It's obviously not great, and all this is led primarily by these really heavy SUVs. The Lucid Air, Hummer EV, the Mercedes EQE, Cybertruck, the Genesis GV60, and I guess the Rivian also comes in somewhere here. Let me just do one thing. So I'm just going to filter the 0 to 60 to sub 4 seconds. And, we have a database of around, I think, 45 or 50 BEVs, and almost like 30 of them do it like in sub 4 or 5 seconds. And here you can see like the gap, it's from 167 feet to like 140 something feet. So again, it's a 20 to 30 foot gap here. Not the most desirable thing. So it's, our manufacturers not putting the best braking hardware to deal with the added weight of BEVs in the hopes that, regen braking will take care of most of the braking needs of battery electric vehicles. So again, something to, think about, and hopefully it gets fixed in years to come. I mean, there are some BEVs which have good braking. Like if you look at the Model 3 has great braking performance, but, a lot of them do not, so yeah. I think the Model X is here. So yeah, let me go back to the PowerPoint slideshow. The third dashboard that we did was just on a simple weight versus acceleration and braking, sorry. Being hit by, 1,000-pound heavier vehicle results in a 47% increase in fatality, as, heavier cars carry more momentum, and thus they need more resilient and bigger braking hardware. And just some facts here. This is a very global audience, so I just thought I'd put this out here. Like in Japan, the average new car weighs 2,600 pounds. In the EU, it's 3,300 pounds. In the US, it's been going up, and we're currently at like 4,400 pounds. So with the cars over 5,000 pounds actually increasing drastically in the last couple of years. So the third dashboard that I'll be showing to y'all is weight versus braking performance for different vehicle types. So this is again for this is for passenger cars. And as the weight increases, you can see that the braking actually gets better. So the x-axis over here is now, oh, sorry. Just give me a second. Yeah. So now the x-axis is vehicle weight in pounds, and the y-axis remains the braking distance in feet from 70 to 0. So you can see a nice, increase in braking performance as we go, as the vehicles get heavier. And the reason for this is most of the heavier vehicles are, flagship cars, Audi RS7s, Tesla Model S's, your German flagship cars. And, manufacturers would like to have them to have the best performance. So they typically kit them out with, heavier brake kits, better pads, braided steel brake lines, and so on and so forth. And so let me just get SUVs and pickups, light trucks back into the mix. And you can see it's going the other way here. As the weight increases, the yellow circles are your SUVs, light trucks. The braking performance gets worse. And your Jeep Wagoneer, Toyota Sequoia, Lexus LX, Ford Expedition, and Ford Ranger, not so great braking performance. And it's the perfect mirror image of what we saw with cars. As the weight increases, the braking performance here is getting considerably worse for SUVs. So again, something that one should keep in mind when one is at the showroom buying their next vehicle. Going back to the slideshow and talking about cost and buying your next vehicle. No surprise, anybody who's been in the market for a newer used car would have experienced sticker shock with car prices being up 21% since 2021. And so assuming you've gone to the showroom, you want to stretch your budget to buy a more expensive variant, a more expensive model, expecting better overall performance. And it's quite funny. Most people, when they go to the showroom, they talk about 0 to 60, but people rarely talk about 70 to 0 in braking, or 60 to 0 even in braking. So just something that that struck us when we were doing this work. So the fourth dashboard that I will be showing to you all is braking performance varying with cost for different vehicle types. And just going to go back to the dashboards. And let me explain the axis here again once it refreshes. So on the x-axis here, I have price, MSRP in dollars. And on the y-axis is again braking distance, 70 miles per hour to 0 in feet. What I have selected now currently is passenger cars. As cars are getting more expensive, the braking performance gets better. The distance, is reducing. And it sort of makes sense. These are more expensive cars. We saw it in the previous graph as well, the heavier, premium German cars and so on and so forth. Premium Teslas and sports cars like the Supras and others, have much better braking performance. There's the Ford Mustang actually has really good braking performance here, as one can see. So yeah, let me do the same thing that I did before and, see how this compares, the same trend compares when we get SUVs back into the mix. So it remains pretty flat. I mean, you could say that there's it actually gets slightly worse. I wouldn't go too much into that data given, actually the spread of models that we have. But yeah, it would, given that, these heavier models tend to have more features, massaging seats, like 10 speakers, 20 speakers, which just add a lot more weight. And we all know that weight is the #1 enemy for braking. And in SUV's case, more weight is not really leading to better performance, and even spending more money is also not really leading to better braking performance, which is this exact opposite of what happens with passenger cars. So again, something, to consider when you're in the market for a new car, that, perhaps, that SUV might not be, the best, option when you're looking at from, safety of not just yourself, but also, avoiding accidents, having better braking, better efficiency. and in general, just having less of an impact on the environment. So yeah. And sorry, let me just come back to the PowerPoint slideshow. Yeah. Yeah, and before we move to questions, I just wanted to spend one slide saying that I don't want to end on a very morose note, saying that it's 80% of the cars that are being sold in the market that are SUVs and pickup trucks are detrimental to public health, and not the performance of the braking is not in par of passenger cars, and so on and so forth. But NHTSA actually has been putting a couple of mandates out, and they've been sort of doing work in this space. So in Feb of 2022, they something which was in the European Union for a long time, adaptive driving beam headlights. This can really improve VRU safety. The New York Times ran an article that most of the vulnerable road user deaths are during the VRs of dusk or dawn. So this can really improve that once it gets standardized. NHTSA has issued mandates for automated emergency braking, that's AEB. This has to be standard in all cars from 2029. So it'll reduce frontal crashes, it'll detect pedestrians crossing the road and automatically brake for you. Again, obviously here it's automated, but how good your car is at braking plays a big part in this as well. If your car is not very good at braking, it takes a long time. So it's being automated is not really going to help. Of course, the reaction time might be lesser, but it merits to have a car that has better braking performance, and then automated emergency braking will just make it so much better in the cases where something you've not noticed something, the visibility was poor, or you were unfortunately distracted. And in September 2024, they propose new vehicle standards to better protect pedestrians. The ridiculously high hood heights of most of the pickup trucks and SUVs that you see tend to push people under the car and not onto the hood, unlike most other sedans and hatchbacks do. Concepts such as hood airbags on the hood don't even exist in the US. Most German cars do have this. So again, hopefully this leads to more safer vehicles, not just for the occupants, but also for the people outside the car. So yeah, so this database, we plan to make it public, because there are only so many ways that we can cut and slice this data. If we make all this data public, you can play with the filters and the levers, select different types of manufacturers. Is Ford doing a better job than GM, or is GM doing a better job than Honda, and or different countries origin manufacturers doing, are the Koreans better than the Japanese, or and so on and so forth. I think there's value in that. That's what we hope to do, and make write a report and make this data public. But we just wanted to give you all a flavor for what we've done, and possibly garner feedback from the audience from this forum. Thank you. Let me stop share, and maybe I can reshare in case there are more. There's some specific question that I need to answer. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bhuvan. We're lucky to have Professor Fred Manwaring join us today. Professor Manwaring is the instrumental scholar in this whole traffic safety field. So Fred, please add a few remarks.
Yes. First of all, very interesting. And as when I gave my talk in the forum, I guess it was in the spring, I mentioned the idea of compensating behavior. And it would seem that the tendency towards bigger and heavier vehicles is that people that are seeking safer vehicles. And then once you have a big, heavy vehicle, you feel safer. Maybe you drive faster or accelerate quicker. And, so it sort of feeds into the same narrative that I mentioned when I was talking about how people compensate for safety features. They probably do the same compensation for a heavy vehicle. If you're in a big, heavy vehicle, it's like, boy, this is great. I can drive faster. I don't, so your whole attitude can potentially change. So but I was told by a colleague at Purdue once that the tendency for Americans to buy heavy vehicles is because our roads are so bad. And so his theory was that, we haven't maintained the roads as well as we could. So you get into a big truck or something, you don't feel those bumps nearly as much as a smaller car. So that's something, I haven't really looked at any literature on that. But what makes the electric vehicle so interesting is it's so easy to get the 0 to 60 because of the instant torque, right? But developing the braking technology to stop that is another level. So that, unlike the gas vehicles where you have to get complex, it's a more complex process to get a 0 to 60. That's ridiculous. For the electric vehicles, it's a simple thing. So that, I think electric vehicles in that sense present an interesting problem. Now, when you look historically, Americans have always tried to get faster and faster cars, but there is one era, and you might think about exploring. There's the so-called Malaise era from 1974 to 1978, where the cars were being strangled by emissions, and there was also the energy crisis. So during that time, the 0 to 60s actually went up, way up, because the horsepower was down. That would be interesting. Now, unfortunately, during that time, we were also in a recession, which tends to suppress fatalities. So, but that might be interesting era to go back and look at how the performance, because that's really the only time that I can think of where the average performance of a vehicle fleet, significantly diminished. Now, there is one, so I always put my own little anecdotal thing. As you were going through, I was looking at my 0 to 60 times of the 8 cars and motorcycles that I own. The 0 to 60s range from 2.8 seconds to 10.7. Now, the 2.8 second is a motorcycle, which can potentially stop very fast, but you have to know, because you're doing the brake force proportioning on front and rear, you really have to know what you're doing to stop fast. It's not like a car where you just step on the brakes and the ABS and all that stuff kicks in. So it is interesting though, how my driving behavior changes depending on which of those cars I'm driving. And some of it is because of the acceleration and the braking. But overall, I think it sort of fits into this, all of the other safety features we're providing, this trade-off between weight and braking. And one final point I wanted to put, in addition to braking, there's also the vehicle dynamics that would be sort of crash avoidance. So maybe center of gravity. You might look at how that's changed. But what's interesting is the electric vehicles are going to have a very low center of gravity, where some of the gas vehicles, as they get bigger, their center of gravity increases. So there might be some, dynamic there that would make them potentially less safe. But, again, quite fascinating. I hadn't seen the actual, diagrams that showed the trade-off between, I always assumed, because in the, 70s and 80s, as the cars got faster, they also had excellent braking, right? Because they were all high performance cars. But now we have non-high performance cars that can go 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds. If you rate performance as the complete package of braking and all the other vehicle dynamics. So it seems that we've gotten away with a straight line acceleration that is starting to exceed some of the other design features of the cars.
Exactly, Professor Manring. The VMT traveled by these cars that can do the 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds is going up like by leaps and bounds. But the braking is nowhere even near to match that performance jobs. I somehow can't buy that point of we are buying SUVs because the roads aren't great here. I mean, having grown up outside the US, I feel the roads here are quite good. And B, SUVs with their leaf springs and solid axle rears aren't really the best in terms of ride comfort. A Mercedes S-Class will outride any big large SUV or pickup truck any day. So I think it's just that people want to buy a large car and they find like ways to justify it.
Yeah. Although I should mention, I did a study in the early 2000s where we drove people around the freeways in Seattle, and we asked them on a scale from 1 to 5, how would you rate this pavement? And people that were in large vehicles rated the pavement significantly smoother than people in the smaller vehicles. You know, so there is some dynamic going on that makes them feel that you know, maybe a large vehicle does make a rough road seem smoother.
Right. Thank you, Fred. Before I give it the phone to John, just add one comment that I think David Zipper made. If you look at the performance, it should be a package, right? But to where the consumer actually pay attention, really very much driven by how the car OEMs broadcast and advertise their product. They did a study. If you look at it on the website, the thing they highlight is the range and acceleration, right? So below 5 seconds, what are we competing for here, right? But that's what the company is setting towards, right? Guided the consumer toward that wrong direction here. Yeah, to you, John.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not necessarily a pleasant experience to accelerate from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. I mean, at some point, it actually, I think, becomes undesirable.
No,
okay.
I should jump in here. I find it quite exhilarating, actually.
Okay, on the motorcycle.
Yeah.
All right. First, just a very practical question from Matthew Reifman, who just asked Bhuvan, is there any chance that the dashboard is public?
Not yet, but it will soon be, yes. We're just like fine-tuning it, dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
Okay, excellent. A lot of discussion generated around a comment question from David Metz, where he said, you know, SUVs are popular in Europe, where the safety record is much better than in the US. So why the difference? And in the chat, a number of things kind of popped up. And so I want to just sort of run through those and see if you have sort of thoughts or reactions. The first one is I think many of us in the US don't realize that for several months now, something called intelligent speed assistance has been required on all vehicles sold in Europe, which is effectively a monitoring system that if the vehicle goes above the speed limit, like a buzzer or an indicator is set off inside the vehicle for the driver. And so there's a whole sort of category. It's been a contentious debate here in the US. Bhuvan, obviously that hasn't entered the research per se, but you know, just any thoughts you want to share about that?
Yeah, I think it all still comes down to the weight. Like I showed, you know, the average weight of the new car in the US is still much more than the EU. You know, SUVs includes a lot of vehicles. So even the Subaru Crosstrek, which is basically just a hatchback, slightly raised, comes under SUVs, you know. So the type of SUVs that are sold in Europe might be much smaller compared to, you know, a Suburban or an Escalade that we get here. So that could be one of the reasons that the weight is still much heavier here. And I mean, I could be biased, but European vehicles typically tend to have better dynamics handling than, and you know, I might get some comments in the chat on this, but then typically American vehicles, so they tend to have, you know, focus on ride and, you know, braking. Especially if you look at your big 3 German companies, they always focus a lot on, you know, ride and handling. So that could be another.
And that was one of the reasons I was suggesting in the chat, which is, you know, a better safety record in Europe because we have smaller SUVs. So yes, They have SUVs, but generally not quite as heavy as some of the vehicles that we're seeing on this side of the pond. Some of the other things that were just suggested, just to put it out there, were manual transmissions, better road design, less vehicle miles traveled. Any thoughts or reflections on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a manual transmission car in the US, so I'm like in the really tiny minority here, and it keeps me much more engaged when I drive around town, as one needs to be. With the automatic transmission, you have that, you know, you have a hand free, and you know the hand is always itching to go towards your mobile phone to see if somebody's messaged or who's posted what. So I think it's human nature to get distracted easily. I think that definitely has, you know, some reason to play. But overall, smaller cars, narrower roads in the EU also, you know, I mean, so much of research that, you know, wider roads are more dangerous for pedestrians to cross. You know, people tend to, there's a sense of, they get lulled into a sense of safety and drive faster. Whereas narrow European roads, you feel like you're going really fast and you're doing like 20 miles an hour, so you don't really go much faster than that. And, you know, you're constantly going between first, second, and third. operating the clutch, and you need to keep an ear and eye out on the engine and things like that. So I mean it's you can't single out one. It's very difficult to single out one factor. It's a combination of all. But weight I think is still the biggest factor over here. Smaller, it's not like all SUVs are bad. Like the Subaru Crosstrek is a great car. It falls under the SUV label, but I mean it weighs like 3,000 pounds, and it's perfect as a city runabout, or even to do highway road trips. So
yeah, and I think it's worth acknowledging the the urban planners in our community who if you make the point, well, what about less vehicle miles traveled in Europe? We might say, hey, there's nothing we can do about that. That's just sort of the land profile that we have in the United States. In Canada, we're more spread out. And it is true that Wyoming is the most dangerous of the states in the US. People who live in Wyoming drive greater distances. It's not necessarily because they're somehow more dangerous drivers than in other states. But do we take that as an assumption, right? So can we, with time, change land use patterns here in the United States so that, and through mode shift, move people out of cars into other modes of transportation, which are significantly more safer than vehicle travel? I think that needs to be part of the conversation. We have to acknowledge that it's difficult to achieve that, but it is achievable for us to change land use patterns and to move away from automotive mobility in urban and suburban areas in the US. Okay, that was more of a commentary from me than a question for you. Let me get on to another question from, let's see, Akash Misa asks, what do you think about the amount of screens in cars nowadays versus more analog controls in older cars from a safety perspective?
I think Volkswagen got heavily panned when the new Golf had touch controls for everything, and they had to go back to physical knobs. Even I think Honda had a similar issue. So there is a point to be made there. Again, a lot of research that when it's a volume knob, you know where it is. You don't have to look at it. There's that extra second that you don't take your eyes off the road. So it's good to have physical knobs for your essential controls. Having everything on a screen costs much lesser for the manufacturer. It's one less knob, one less dial to order. So obviously they want to put everything on the screen. But between customer feedback and customer just making their decision through their wallet choice, and maybe policy on having dials for your essential controls, like indicator stocks. People are used to this. I am not a fan of the the half steering wheel that Tesla has on the Model S Plaid, because those are things which again people are not really used to. So and I think the other thing with screens is more distraction points just come up, and I don't know if there's too much research done on this, but the ambient lighting, especially at nighttime when the screens are really bright and in your eyes, and then you have to adjust to a dimly lit road and a dog that is starting to cross the road. There could be some issues there. I don't want to, I've not seen much research done on this, but that would be one area which I would, like to see some work being done, because I thought folks had their, cabin lights on, but it was just the screens lighting their faces up in, some of the cars that I see when I walk on the road. It's these massive end-to-end screens can put out a lot of white lights. So hopefully manufacturers have, if you're not using the screen for 5 seconds, an auto dim feature just, dims everything off to acceptable levels.
Yeah, and move on. Another thing that came up in the chat was about headlights, and any sort of thoughts to share about headlights, positioning, driving at night?
Yeah, so I mean the NHTSA, headlight automatic headlight adjustment. It's a good step. Intelligent headlights can really help. But if these pickup trucks have the headlights positioned at the roof of where your typical sedan is, that's not really going to help, because it's going to point in your eye. So we need to have it's again a question of the hood height. The higher the hood, the higher the headlight as well. So we need to the amount of light output and the positioning it needs to be codified in my opinion.
Yeah. And wasn't there some finding that the riskiest time of driving is
Yes.
evening?
The New York Times article, yes. Dusk.
Yeah. Dusk is the riskiest time
Yes.
to be driving. Okay. And Seamus Joyce Johnson said, one thing I've been wondering about that I haven't seen much coverage of is the acceleration profile of modern gas pedals, which I find are quite jumpy and make it difficult to drive under 25 miles per hour. Whereas I find that cars from 15 to 20 years ago had a much more gradual speed curve that made it feel more natural to drive slowly. Any reactions?
So a lot of manufacturers put in different modes. Now you have a city mode, you have a sport mode, you have a a dynamic mode. So that sort of addresses this issue. You keep it in city mode, and the response is not as snappy as Seamus mentioned. But so hopefully that can address this. But typically with manufacturers want to have the initial acceleration feel snappy, so that when you're going on a test drive, you feel like, okay, this is a great car, let me put my money down for it. I think it's a question of being in the right mode. You shouldn't be in sport mode in the city, because that what gets you, the correlation between what you're doing on your foot and the actual acceleration can be quite unnerving. And this can be a problem with EVs as well, because you get the immediate torque from zero. So the tuning and ensuring that in a city the car is in city mode and not put in track mode or whatever, to show off your 0 to 60 acceleration, it should be some sort of I mean, it's a problem that is fixable. It's a simple tuning software issue.
Yeah. And I mean, just to wrap up, I mean, in the chat, there's a lot of suggestions for future research direction that I think are quite valuable. Just as an example, Scott Smith said, I would be interested in the effect of increasing vehicle heights and widths on the design of on-street parking and bike fatalities. Increasing vehicle widths are putting many bike lanes squarely in the door zone. These are very, sort of practical suggestions for the research agenda on this hugely important topic, which, as we opened with, unfortunately, we seem to be moving in the wrong direction in the United States. So any sort of further research that can help to reverse that trend, I think would be quite helpful. So back to you, Jinhua.
And thank you, John. Yeah, Boo, I'm really glad that you actually did the research and presenting and the great effort of collecting this data set, and hope we'll share that soon with everyone to jointly contribute to this exercise there, right? Also, thank John and Fred for the commentary on this. Just take maybe 10 seconds. I'll share about next week's forum. Next week, people know that it will be an interesting week, but we invited two persons. One, Stephen Zoif, who worked at the US DOT Office Science and the Technology Office for many years. And the second one is Beth Osborne, who runs the Transportation of America, right? We are both to give 10 recommendations for the incoming transportation leadership, right? Hopefully many of us can join and enjoy the conversation there. Please join me. Thank Boo and John again for the conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. See you guys next Friday. Next. Fred, thank you again.